Andres, for your kind presentation. And well, the purpose of my presentation is to explain the impact of digital platforms on a heavily regulated industry like the taxi sector in Spain, to show why this phenomenon makes legal change necessary, what obstacles might hinder these legal changes, and how these obstacles could be overcome. Well, in order to understand that impact, we should take under consideration the status quo firstly. And from an economic point of view, in the taxi sector, in the taxi market, we could find three segments. The hailing segment. There are cabs which are circulating on the streets. You can and they can pick up passengers who raise their hand. We find the taxi rank segment, and we could also find the telephone booking segment. Well, from a legal point of view, we find two types of vehicles. The taxis, in some countries they are called black cabs. In Spain, there are currently 65 more or less thousand taxis. And on the other hand, the so-called VTCs, okay, vehículos turismo con conductor. In some countries, they are called private hire vehicles. In 2000, there were more or less 3,000 VTCs, and now there are 17,000. Okay, and the taxis may operate in the three above mentioned segments, while VTCs can only operate in the telephone booking segment. VTCs were a kind of luxury taxis. They provided luxury or special services. Or traditionally, they have provided luxury special services. Well, this sector, both taxis and VTCs, are subject to several restrictions or forms of regulation. We find firstly safety and quality standards, and the state verifies that both taxis and VTCs meet those standards by means of a license, an administrative authorization. Secondly, there are quantitative restrictions, so the number of licenses and vehicles are limited. But here, I would say by accident, from 2009 to 2015, there was no quantitative restrictions for VTCs. Okay, the sector was, it was not clear, but the courts interpreted and declared that there were no restriction during that time. It provoked that the number of VTCs increased over those years from 3,000 to almost 17,000. Thirdly, the size of the firm in some regions is restricted. For instance, currently in Valencia, one person can only hold one taxi license. So he or she can only drive one car. So the scale of the firm is heavily restricted. There are also territorial restrictions because the authorizations are granted by a municipality, and taxis can only pick passengers in that municipality. If they drive a passenger, a user, to another municipality, the taxi may not pick a passenger in that municipality. So it creates, of course, substantial inefficiencies. Okay. And finally, there are price regulations, but only for taxis, not for BTCs. Well, what's the justification for those restrictions? Well, there are several, or there were several. Arguably, there were several market failures, asymmetric information, which could justify quality and safety standards, plus the administrative authorization. There were transaction costs, which arguably justifies the price regulation because it's too difficult to negotiate. The negotiations between the drivers and the passengers were, or at least were, too difficult and too costly. And there are also negative externalities, pollution and traffic congestion, which arguably justify the quantitative restrictions and also the territorial restrictions. And, well, you could say that a taxi authorization is a kind of a gift, a public gift, a windfall profit. Okay? And you would like this gift, this windfall profit, to be spread among the population. So it could justify the restriction on the size of the firms. Okay. Well, and how the sharing economy has impacted on this sector? Well, I guess you already know what's the sharing economy. This famous communication, the European Commission defines it as business models where activities are facilitated by collaborative platforms that create an open marketplace for the temporary usage of goods or services, often provided by private individuals. I want to point out that these digital platforms facilitate transactions that used to be more or even too costly. These digital platforms reduce asymmetric information by means of so-called reputational rating systems. They reduce transaction costs by means of smartphones, GPS, algorithms, and so on, and create economies of scale and network effects. So it means that the larger the scale of the firm, the larger the firm, the more efficient it is. So the more consumers and providers participate, the better for both of them. So, of course, there are also risks and fair competition. We've seen. So during the summer school, the issues of regarding unfair competition, privacy issues, antitrust issues, labor law issues, data protection, discrimination, and tax evasion. But interestingly, for instance, regarding tax evasion, of course, for instance, Uber pays taxes in the Netherlands, but so it doesn't pay any tax or almost any tax in Spain, but the VTC license holders pay much more taxes than taxi drivers. So 9 for each vehicle, 9 more times. So that's interesting because it shows that regulatory authorities are captured or have been traditionally captured by the taxi sector. Okay, because taxi sector in Spain is almost a tax haven. Okay. Well, of course, you could think that legal changes are needed because the current legislation do not strike a fair balance between the interests at stake. Why? Well, firstly, I'm a public lawyer, and I see that most of those traditional restrictions have become disproportionate if they weren't yet. For instance, quality standards. Well, quality standards were justified because of asymmetric information. But you could argue that market participants can monitor performance with fewer costs than public authorities, by those, for instance, rating systems. And therefore, they can provide better information and improve the incentives of service providers. Quantitative restrictions. I want to point out, it has been pointed out, that they are very costly because they imply longer, so they imply a restriction of suppliers, the number of suppliers, and they imply longer waiting times, less competition, worse incentives. Secondly, they could be counterproductive because it may promote the use of private vehicles. So you cannot be sure that if people don't have the opportunity to use Uber or Cabify, they are going to use public transportation. They might use private cars. And thirdly, it is shown that Pigouvian taxes are more efficient to prevent pollution and congestion. It's better to tax those activities than to restrict the supply, the number of suppliers. And well, you could argue that those restrictions are unjustified or unjustifiable. For instance, territorial restriction, that inefficiency. If a taxi driver picks a passenger in Valencia and goes to the airport, that taxi in some regions, in some cities, may not pick a passenger in the airport, okay? Well, there are exceptions, of course, but it's not efficient, okay? And the fair regulation, yeah, of course, it was justified because transaction costs were very high 20 years ago. But now the algorithms and those digital platforms have reduced those transaction costs very substantially. Okay? And the fair regulation prevents firms from establishing a market clearing price. Okay? Prevent firms to establish, from matching the supply and demand, which is very costly from an economic point of view. And vice versa, you could argue that there were some rules which were disproportionate, or which could be considered as disproportionate 20 years ago, that might become proportionate and justifiable. For instance, a ban of hailing taxes could be now very sensible, because hailing taxes, that hailing segment, is pollutes too much and causes traffic congestion. And now, by means of the smartphones and so on, you can reduce traffic congestion and also pollution. Okay, that ban could be disproportionate 20 years ago, but now it could be very sensible. Well, and there are several obstacles to these required legal changes. Firstly, there is a lot of uncertainty regarding the social costs and benefits of the sharing economies. They are not very clear for everyone. Secondly, you could find here many interconnected and unresolved issues: taxation, labor issues, privacy, and so on. For instance, I would allow Uber and those digital platforms to operate in Spain, but I would like, I wanted Uber to pay taxes in Spain, but it doesn't depend on the Spanish authorities, okay, to force the Spanish authorities are not able to impose the obligation upon Uber. Okay, and it's difficult to resolve all of these issues at once. It's not possible. It's very difficult to solve them at once. And finally, we find here a problem of regulatory capture by incumbents, by the taxi drivers, because they are more cohesive and smaller group of interested parties. They have less coordination costs. They have better incentives to exert pressure on the regulatory authorities. And of course, taxi strikes are very costly, okay, for everyone, and of course for the regulatory authorities. You can two pictures that they are very funny in my opinion, because the first picture was taken when the Valencian law, the draft, was presented before the parliament. And you can find only representatives of the taxi sector and deputies, Valencian deputies. And the second one was taken when the law was approved. And you can find only representatives of the taxi sector and the deputies. So there are no users, no representatives of the VTCs, and so on. I think that's quite illustrative. The reaction of the Spanish authorities. How have the Spanish authorities reacted? Well, in the first phase, they tried to preserve the status quo. And afterwards, when those digital platforms became bigger, much more bigger, they, well, of course, because of the pressure of the taxi sector, they tried to drive those digital platforms out of the market. Okay? Red card and ejection. Well, in the first phase, no legal changes were made. The administrative authorities refused to grant the VTC licenses, so applicants needed to litigate in order to get them. Public authorities took measures aimed at hindering the activity of VTCs, took measures aimed at favoring taxi drivers. For instance, they bought with public money the licenses, thereby reducing their supply. But with public money, that's quite interesting. And the Supreme Court upheld almost all the traditional restrictions, with very few exceptions, which have been challenged by digital platforms, VTC firms, and even the Spanish Competition Authority. In the second phase, the Spanish government, because of the pressures of the taxi sector, established that. Okay, so the Spanish government firstly established a decree law, and it established that in 4-6 years, depending on the case, current VTC licenses will not allow the activity of urban transportation, and therefore these licenses will lose all their value, because almost 100% of the services are urban services. You understand? So you cannot provide almost any service with those licenses. And secondly, this decree allows regions to impose additional restrictions for those 4-6 years. Okay? What's the rationale or the pretext? Pollution. VTCs cause a lot of pollution, unlike taxis, maybe. Traffic congestion. Oh, VTCs create a lot of traffic congestion, unlike taxis. And they create a lot of social conflicts. taxi strikes. Okay, and by virtue of this decree law, some regions and cities like Valencia have imposed additional restrictions. For instance, in Valencia and in other cities, Barcelona, for instance, there must be a minimum period from 15 minutes up to 60 minutes in Valencia, for instance, between the booking and the provision of the service. Secondly, VTCs may not circulate or park on the streets when not providing a service. Digital platforms may not show the geolocation of VTCs to users. So, smartphones, geolocation of smartphones is banned. VTCs are not allowed to approach areas when the demand is particularly high. Malls, for instance, airports, they may not approach or park, okay, close to those facilities. And VTCs must be zero emission cars, which is contradictory, because if you prohibit VTCs because they pollute, and you impose the obligation of using zero emission cars, it doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. But okay, that's what we have. The courts, well, those restrictions, as you may imagine, have been challenged before the courts. Some courts have declared that some of these restrictions are unjustifiable, and it's what I see. But I don't know if you know it, but Spanish courts, particularly the Constitutional Court, are very deferential when reviewing restrictions on economic freedom. Okay, I think we are in Chile. It's completely different, but in Spain, the Spanish courts are very deferential. The future is uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen, because and how the Constitutional Court will resolve these cases. I don't know. I want to point out that there have been also some non-hostile regions, let's say. For instance, Madrid, Andalucía, La Rioja, and Cantabria, they have not imposed additional restrictions, and they will probably allow digital platforms to operate after those 4 or 6 years. Why? I don't know, but maybe there are political reasons. Right-wing parties tend, not always, they're not very hostile against that platforms. But for me, I think that the fundamental cause is that the ratio of VTCs taxes is relatively high in those regions, and it's difficult from a political point of view to ban an activity that generates thousands of direct jobs. Okay, it has a political cost. Lessons to be drawn, very, very quick. In an article I published in 2016, I proposed several regulatory strategies in order to facilitate legal change in this sector. I think that the most effective and most relevant tool or regulatory strategies, this one, the coexistence of different regulations, or the coexistence between the traditional sector and the digital sector. Okay, it makes it possible to compare which system is more efficient, and now we are seeing, in my opinion, that the digital platforms are much more efficient. And there are also empirical studies that show that these sharing economy platforms are more efficient. They provide these services with less costs. And the coexistence reduces the resistance of incumbents to legal change. The taxi drivers were not very preoccupied 10 years ago. But of course, when Uber, Cabify became bigger, they exerted pressure on the public authorities for these digital platforms to be expelled from the market. Do you understand? That coexistence might take place by design. It's quite rare. By accident, which is what happened in Spain. Or de facto, by platforms disregarding the law. This is the traditional strategy from Uber. Okay? Uber has ignored the laws. It tried to do so in Spain, but it failed, and it has had success in many countries. Okay, so if digital platforms are more efficient, which is what I see in this sector, they will become bigger and bigger, and once they are big enough, it is too costly for the public authorities, and of course, for users, drivers, which could exert pressure on public authorities, and of course, digital platforms get leverage from users, drivers, in order to exert pressure on public authorities. And it's too costly for the regulatory authorities to drive them out of the market. Okay, and that's what's happening, at least in some regions in Spain, in Madrid, in Andalusia, and in other small regions. Okay, and that's all. Okay, so thank you very much.
Many thanks for this complete explanation about the fight between Uber regulators and all the incumbents, like the taxi sector in the case of Spain, from which we can draw some lessons for other countries too. So I don't know if there's a question, or if we have questions here, or if we have questions online. If not, I would. Yes, we have one question over there. Yes. But
hi, thanks. That was really interesting. I suppose I'm just wondering, because I'm not from a law background, so I'm just asking a kind of a more general kind of question, I suppose. What exactly is the substantial
doesn't make any sense, because the Spanish economy has substantially grown since 1990. The volume of tourists has increased substantially since 1990. So the point is that in Spain, taxi drivers are taking advantage of a kind of monopoly. So the supply is substantially restricted, and that's why they are getting monopoly rents. Do you understand? That's the point. So if you and the point is that in other countries the taxi sector has been liberalized. Those quantitative restrictions have been eliminated. Okay. And that's the point. So that's the main point, because we've increased the number of vehicles providing the same service by 14,000. Do you understand? And it has reduced the profits of the taxi drivers. Or they consider that this partial liberalization has reduced the profits. And the threat is that what would happen if this process of liberalization continues? Do you understand? So that's the threat. That's the threat. So the problem is you can find now some providers that you could argue that they are more efficient, but the main point is the number. So there is an increase of the supply, and for a monopolist, that increase is not very good. Do you understand?
Many thanks. We're running out of time, so we have to move to the next panelist. But before doing that, I would want to ask a very, very quick question about one fact, which is that this is a sector in which digital economy and sharing economy has quickly evolved, not to a platform being only a broker, but a platform who is actively an actor in the market. And that means that, well, regulation has to take that into account, but in Spain, and in the case that you explained to us, the direct consequence of that is that once these big companies over Cabify in Spain had realized they had enough, or at least a sufficient number for the moment, of licenses of VTC to operate and to be inside the market and compete with incumbents, all this conflict has disappeared, at least for the moment, which I consider is really interesting. And maybe that can be a point in favor of all the incumbents. That makes them not better, but it's clear that competition is driven not because of general interest, but only because of the interest of those very vertical integrated companies that want to be in the market. And once they have succeeded in doing that, the pressure against regulation and public activities has decreased. What do you think on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because Cabify now is an incumbent, because you understand, because especially Cabify, because Cabify has a lot of VTC licenses, and Cabify, I think that Cabify thinks that Uber could be more efficient than Cabify. You understand? And they don't want competition, so they are quite right now. Okay, and by contrast, I think that Uber prefers the complete liberalization. In fact, in 2015, the quantitative restrictions were being challenged before the Supreme Court, and only Uber maintained the challenge. Do you understand? So Cabify didn't challenge that restriction. That's what you're saying. You're suggesting that Cabify now is another incumbent, another monopolist. You understand?